Sarah Mitchell wheeled herself toward the special viewing area at Kruger Wildlife Sanctuary with her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, a physical manifestation of the anxiety and desperate hope that had been building since she agreed to this visit 3 days earlier when Sanctuary Director David McCona had called with an offer that seemed both like a lifeline and a potential devastating disappointment. 10 years had passed since Sarah had last seen Nala, 10 years since she had visited the sanctuary with any regularity, and the rational part of her brain kept insisting that expecting a lion to remember a human after a decade of separation was foolish wishful thinking born of desperation rather than any realistic assessment of animal memory capabilities. But Sarah had come anyway because she had nothing else left to try, no other source of hope or meaning in the 6 months since the drunk driver had run a red light at 80 km/h and crashed into Sarah's truck and shattered her 12th thoracic vertebra and destroyed everything she had been before that moment. David walked beside Sarah's wheelchair offering reassurance that felt both kind and slightly patronizing in the way that well-meaning people often spoke to her now that she was disabled, and he repeated the warning he had given over the phone. "Keep your expectations low, Sarah. It's been 10 years. Nala was just a cub when you knew her, and you were a completely different person then. You were standing, you were strong, you moved differently, you probably smelled different because your body chemistry has changed. Memory in lions is not well understood, but we know it's heavily dependent on sensory cues, and if too many of those cues are different, she may not recognize you at all." Sarah nodded to show she understood, but inside she was screaming because she needed this, needed some sign that who she had been before the accident still mattered, that the 15 years she had spent as a ranger protecting wildlife had left some mark on the world beyond the bureaucratic records and the few photographs she couldn't bear to look at anymore. The viewing area was a specialized enclosure designed for close observation of specific animals under controlled conditions, featuring reinforced glass barriers that allowed proximity while maintaining absolute safety for both humans and animals. David explained the protocol as they positioned Sarah's wheelchair in front of the glass. Nala would be released from her holding area into the observation zone, and they would see how she responded to Sarah's presence. But under no circumstances should Sarah expect or hope for dramatic recognition, because even if Nala did remember something, lions didn't express emotion or recognition in ways that humans found obvious or satisfying. Sarah felt her throat tighten with preemptive grief for the disappointment she was certain was coming, but she stayed silent and waited as David radioed the keepers to release Nala from the holding area. Before we continue this incredible journey of reunion and healing, if stories about the enduring bonds between humans and animals that persist across years of separation touch your heart, consider subscribing to Lion King Stories. Every subscription helps us share more of these remarkable true tales that prove memory and gratitude can transcend the boundaries we assume exist between species, and that love freely given is never truly forgotten even when circumstances separate those who shared profound moments of connection. Your support helps spread the message that the relationships we form with animals matter deeply to them just as they matter to us, and that sometimes the greatest healing comes not from medicine or therapy but from being remembered by someone we saved when remembering seems impossible. Nala emerged from the holding area with the fluid, powerful grace that characterized healthy adult lionesses, 180 kilograms of pure predatory muscle moving with deliberate purpose as she surveyed her surroundings and assessed the situation with the calm intelligence that Sarah remembered from the cub she had rescued 10 years earlier. The lioness was magnificent in her prime at 10 years old, her tawny coat glossy and well-maintained, her amber eyes clear and alert as they scanned the observation area looking for whatever had prompted her keepers to move her to this unfamiliar location. For several seconds Nala's gaze passed over Sarah without any visible reaction, and Sarah felt her heart sink with the weight of confirmed expectations that this visit had been a mistake born of desperate need rather than realistic hope. Then Nala's eyes returned to Sarah's position at the glass barrier, and the lioness went completely still in a way that made every person watching hold their breath, because that particular quality of frozen attention was not casual curiosity or neutral observation but focused recognition of something significant. Nala stared at Sarah for 5 full seconds without moving anything except her eyes, which tracked across Sarah's face and body as if cataloging features and comparing them against memories stored a decade earlier when this human had been vertical and strong instead of seated and broken. The silence in the observation area was absolute as David and the 2 keepers present watched this interaction with the kind of professional focus that came from years of studying animal behavior and knowing when something unusual was occurring. Then Nala made a sound that caused David to whisper, "Oh my God," under his breath, because what emerged from the lioness was the low rumbling vocalization that lions reserved for greeting known individuals after periods of separation. A sound that adult lions simply did not make toward strangers or casual acquaintances, but that signaled recognition and positive association with specific familiar beings. Nala began moving toward the glass barrier with deliberate steps that communicated purpose rather than random curiosity, and when she reached the position directly opposite Sarah's wheelchair, she sat down in a controlled movement that brought her massive head to approximately the same height as Sarah's face, creating the kind of direct eye contact that predators typically avoided with prey or threats but that social animals used when engaging with trusted companions. Sarah found herself crying before she fully processed what was happening, tears streaming down her face as 10 years of separation and 6 months of depression and the accumulated weight of believing she no longer mattered to anyone or anything suddenly lifted in the space of those 5 seconds of frozen recognition. "You remember me?" Sarah whispered, her voice breaking with emotion that she had been holding back for months because crying in front of her physical therapists or doctors or the few friends who still visited felt like weakness, but crying in front of Nala felt like safety, like being seen by the only being in the world who remembered who Sarah had been before the accident had reduced her to a diagnosis and a disability. "After 10 years, you remember me?" Nala responded to Sarah's voice by making that rumbling greeting sound again, louder and more sustained this time, and then she pressed her massive head against the glass barrier directly opposite Sarah's face in what appeared to be an attempt to make physical contact despite the transparent barrier that separated them. Nala began moving toward the glass barrier with deliberate steps that communicated purpose rather than random curiosity, and when she reached the position directly opposite Sarah's wheelchair, she sat down in a controlled movement that brought her massive head to approximately the same height as Sarah's face, creating the kind of direct eye contact that predators typically avoided with prey or threats but that social animals used when engaging with trusted companions. Sarah raised her hand to press her palm against the glass where Nala's head was positioned, and the lioness held that position for nearly a minute while both of them remained motionless in what observers later described as one of the most remarkable displays of cross-species recognition and affection they had ever witnessed. David was recording the interaction on his phone because he understood that what he was watching needed to be documented and that skeptics would later question whether the behavior actually demonstrated genuine memory and recognition rather than random affectionate responses that some captive lions displayed toward human visitors. The story of how Sarah and Nala had first met needed to be told from the beginning to understand why this reunion mattered so deeply and why the bond between them had survived a decade of separation that should have erased any memory or attachment. The year was 2005, and Sarah Mitchell was 28 years old and in her 5th year working as a ranger in Kruger National Park, one of the largest game reserves in Africa and a location where the challenges of conservation and anti-poaching efforts created daily tests of her commitment and resilience. Sarah had chosen ranger work after completing a degree in wildlife biology because she wanted her life to mean something beyond personal comfort or financial success, and she had proven herself capable and dedicated in ways that earned respect from colleagues who initially doubted whether a woman could handle the physical and emotional demands of the position. The call had come over the Ranger radio network on a Tuesday morning in March, a brief transmission from a patrol unit that had discovered a dead lioness in Grid Sector 47, killed by poachers whose bullet wounds were clearly visible and who had removed choice body parts for sale in illegal wildlife markets that operated despite increasing enforcement efforts. The protocol for such discoveries involved documenting the kill site, searching for evidence that might help identify the poachers, and checking the immediate area for any cubs that might have been orphaned by the killing because lion mothers typically hid their young while hunting and the cubs would be nearby waiting for a return that would never come. Sarah had been off duty that morning but she heard the radio call while driving back to the ranger station, and something about the location made her decide to respond because Grid 47 was an area where she had observed a lioness with cubs several weeks earlier during routine patrols. When Sarah arrived at the kill site, the other rangers had already documented the scene and were beginning the grim task of removing the carcass for disposal, and they confirmed that they had searched the immediate area but found no evidence of cubs despite the dead lioness showing clear signs of recent nursing that indicated young offspring who needed their mother's milk to survive. Sarah insisted on conducting a more extensive search despite the other rangers suggesting that any cubs were probably already dead from exposure or predation, and she spent 3 hours methodically checking every possible hiding spot within a half-kilometer radius of the kill site, looking in trees and dense brush and rocky outcroppings where a lioness might have placed vulnerable young for safety. She found Nala in a shallow depression beneath an overhanging rock ledge approximately 200 meters from where her mother had died, and the cub's condition was critical in ways that made Sarah understand she had perhaps minutes rather than hours to prevent another death. Nala was approximately 2 months old based on size and development, weighing perhaps 4 or 5 kilograms, and she had clearly been without food or water for at least 3 days based on her severe dehydration and the way her ribs were visible through her dull matted fur. The cub was barely conscious when Sarah found her, lying motionless beside her dead mother's scent trail that she had apparently followed from her hiding spot in a desperate attempt to locate the parent who would never return. And her breathing was shallow and irregular in ways that indicated her body was beginning to shut down from the combined stresses of dehydration and starvation and exposure. Sarah scooped Nala into her arms with a gentleness that surprised her because she had been trained to maintain professional emotional distance from the animal she protected. And she felt tears burning in her eyes as she looked at this tiny dying creature who represented both the tragedy of illegal poaching and the possibility of salvaging something good from senseless death. "You're not going to die," Sarah heard herself saying out loud even though no one was there to hear except the unresponsive cub cradled against her chest. "I won't let you die. Stay with me. Please stay with me." The moment when Sarah lifted Nala from that rocky depression was seared into her memory with the kind of crystalline detail that traumatic or profoundly meaningful experiences created, and years later she could still recall exactly how the cub's fur had felt against her skin, dry and brittle from dehydration, and how light Nala had been, far too light for a 2-month-old lion cub who should have been healthy and robust. Sarah had cradled Nala against her chest and felt the irregular flutter of the cub's heartbeat through the thin layer of skin and fur. A rhythm that was too fast and too weak and that communicated how close to death this small creature was. The cub's eyes were partially open but unfocused, showing no awareness of being picked up or moved, and her tongue was visible between slightly parted jaws, dark and dry in ways that indicated severe fluid deficit. Sarah ran back to her vehicle with Nala pressed against her body, moving as quickly as she could while trying to minimize jarring movements that might cause additional distress to the dying cub, and she radioed ahead to the veterinary clinic to alert them about the incoming emergency. The veterinarian on call, Dr. Themba Nkosi, asked questions about the cub's condition and gave preliminary instructions for supportive care during transport. Keep the cub warm, try to provide small amounts of water if the animal was conscious enough to swallow, monitor breathing and be prepared to provide rescue breaths if respiration stopped entirely. Sarah acknowledged these instructions while simultaneously starting her truck and beginning the drive that she knew would take at least 3 hours under good conditions. 3 hours during which Nala might die despite everything Sarah could do to prevent it. The drive to the veterinary clinic was the longest 3 hours of Sarah's life as she held Nala against her body to provide warmth and stimulation, talking constantly to the cub who showed only occasional signs of awareness through weak movements or sounds that might have been responses or might have been the random neural activity of a dying brain. Sarah wrapped Nala in her own shirt to trap body heat and she stopped twice to try giving the cub small amounts of water from a sports bottle using a dropper from her first aid kit. And each time Nala managed to swallow a few drops, Sarah felt a surge of hope that maybe, just maybe, this tiny life could be saved despite odds that seemed overwhelming. During that drive, Sarah found herself talking to Nala in ways she had never spoken to an animal before, not giving commands or making observational comments but actually communicating as if to another conscious being who could understand meaning even if not words. She told Nala about the other rangers searching for evidence of the poachers, about the sanctuary where David McCona cared for orphaned wildlife, about all the days and years that stretched ahead if only Nala could hold on long enough to receive medical treatment. She described the life Nala could have, growing strong and healthy and eventually maybe even having cubs of her own if she was ever released back into protected wildlands, painting pictures of futures that might never happen but that Sarah needed to believe in because the alternative was watching this cub die in her arms after she had promised she wouldn't let death happen. Approximately halfway through the drive, Nala's breathing became even more labored and irregular, and for several terrifying minutes Sarah thought she was witnessing the final stages of respiratory failure that would end with death despite her best efforts. She pulled over to the side of the road and checked Nala's vital signs as best she could without proper equipment, finding a heart rate that was dangerously elevated and body temperature that felt too low to her touch. Sarah made a decision in that moment that violated protocol but felt necessary. She called Dr. Nkosi again and described what she was observing, and the veterinarian walked her through emergency warming procedures that involved placing the cub inside Sarah's shirt directly against her skin to provide maximum heat transfer while also creating a humid environment that might help with Nala's breathing difficulties. The sensation of Nala's small body against Sarah's bare skin was intimate in ways that created an immediate and powerful bond that went beyond professional care or rescue instinct. And Sarah felt Nala's heart beating against her own chest in a rhythm that seemed to synchronize over the next several minutes as the cub's body absorbed warmth from Sarah's core temperature. Whether this intervention actually made a medical difference or simply provided comfort during a dying process that couldn't be stopped, Sarah would never know for certain, but what she did know was that Nala survived that crisis point and her breathing stabilized enough to continue the remainder of the drive without additional emergencies. When Sarah finally pulled into the veterinary clinic parking lot and carried Nala inside still wrapped against her chest, the cub was still alive, and that fact alone felt like a miracle that defied the grim statistics about orphaned wildlife survival rates. She called David McCona at Kruger Wildlife Sanctuary during that drive because she knew that even if Nala survived the immediate crisis, a 2-month-old orphan cub could not be released back into the wild and would need long-term care at a facility equipped for that purpose. Nala did survive, though the veterinarian later told Sarah that if she had arrived even an hour later, the outcome would almost certainly have been death because the cub's organs were beginning to fail from dehydration and her body temperature had dropped to dangerous levels that impaired the function of critical biological systems. The treatment involved intravenous fluids and warming blankets and tube feeding of specialized formula, and Nala spent 5 days in intensive veterinary care before she was stable enough to be transported to Kruger Wildlife Sanctuary, where David McCona had prepared a specialized enclosure for raising orphaned big cats. Sarah visited Nala every day during those 5 days at the veterinary clinic, spending hours sitting beside the incubator where the cub was being monitored and treated, and she continued visiting 3 times per week for the next 10 months after Nala was transferred to the sanctuary. Those 10 months of regular visits had created a bond that was obvious to everyone at the sanctuary because Nala's response to Sarah was distinctly different from her response to other humans, including her regular keepers who provided daily care and feeding. When Sarah visited, Nala would immediately vocalize and move toward her with clear excitement and positive engagement, pressing against the barriers and making contact-seeking sounds that young cubs typically reserved for their mothers. Sarah would spend hours during these visits simply sitting near Nala's enclosure talking to her or watching her play or sleep, and the cub's presence had filled something in Sarah's life that she hadn't realized was empty until this relationship showed her what connection across species boundaries could feel like when it was genuine and mutual rather than the professional detachment she maintained with other animals. The pattern of their visits during those 10 months had developed its own rhythm and rituals that became increasingly important to both Sarah and Nala as the weeks passed. Sarah would typically arrive at the sanctuary in the late afternoon after completing her ranger duties, still wearing her work clothes and carrying the scent of the bush and the animals she had been observing or tracking during her patrols. Nala seemed to recognize Sarah's arrival even before she came into view, becoming alert and active in her enclosure approximately 5 minutes before Sarah actually appeared, suggesting that the cub could either hear Sarah's vehicle approaching or sense her presence through some mechanism that the sanctuary staff couldn't fully explain. When Sarah entered the viewing area adjacent to Nala's enclosure, the cub's response was immediate and unmistakable. A burst of vocalizations that ranged from high-pitched mews to rumbling sounds that were the precursors to adult roars, combined with physical displays of excitement that included running back and forth along the barrier and attempting to climb or jump higher to get closer to Sarah's position. The keepers had explained that this level of engagement was unusual even for hand-raised cubs who typically showed enthusiasm toward their regular caregivers but reserved their most intense bonding behaviors for the humans who fed them multiple times per day. Nala's response to Sarah exceeded even the attachment she showed to her primary keeper, despite Sarah's visits being only 3 times per week compared to the daily care the keeper staff provided. Sarah's visits followed a relatively consistent structure that seemed to provide comfort and predictability for both participants. She would begin by sitting on the ground near the barrier that separated her from Nala's enclosure, positioning herself at the cub's eye level rather than standing above in a position that might feel threatening or dominating to a young lion. Nala would immediately come to the nearest point along the barrier and press herself against it, trying to make as much physical contact as possible through the chain-link fencing that prevented actual touching but allowed proximity and scent exchange. Sarah would extend her hand toward Nala's position, and they would often remain in this configuration for 10 or 15 minutes in what appeared to be a greeting ritual that acknowledged their relationship and re-established connection after days of separation. After this initial greeting phase, Sarah would typically talk to Nala about her day and her work, describing the animal she had seen and the challenges she had faced and the satisfaction or frustration she felt about various aspects of ranger life. She spoke in the same conversational tone she would use with a human friend, not simplifying her language or limiting herself to commands or simple phrases, and whether Nala understood any specific content or simply responded to the emotional tone and familiar voice patterns, the cub always appeared attentive during these one-sided conversations. Sometimes Nala would vocalize in ways that sounded like responses, creating a pattern of call and answer that felt remarkably like dialogue, even though Sarah knew intellectually that lions couldn't comprehend human language in any meaningful way. The middle portion of each visit often involved Sarah simply observing Nala at play, watching the cub interact with the enrichment items and toys that keepers had provided to stimulate natural hunting and exploring behaviors. Sarah would comment on Nala's activities as if providing sports commentary, narrating the cub's stalking approaches and pouncing attacks on inanimate objects with the same enthusiasm she might bring to watching a human child at play. These observations allowed Sarah to see Nala's personality emerging as she matured from a helpless infant into an increasingly capable and curious young lion, and Sarah found herself marveling at the transformation she was witnessing from the near-dead cub she had rescued to this vibrant, energetic creature who embodied all the power and grace that made lions such compelling animals. The final phase of each visit involved what Sarah privately thought of as quiet time, when Nala would eventually tire from play and settle down near the barrier where Sarah sat, and they would simply be together in companionable silence that felt restorative in ways that Sarah couldn't quite articulate. Sometimes Nala would groom herself during these quiet periods, licking her paws and face with the fastidious attention to cleanliness that cats displayed from early age, and Sarah would watch this grooming with a kind of meditative focus that allowed her mind to quiet and her stress to dissipate in ways that no other activity in her life seemed to achieve. Other times Nala would simply lie down and appear to doze while maintaining awareness of Sarah's presence, opening her eyes periodically to check that Sarah was still there before relaxing back into rest, and Sarah interpreted this behavior as trust and security that Nala felt when Sarah was near. As the months progressed and Nala grew larger and stronger, the physical dynamics of their interactions began to change in ways that both delighted and slightly worried Sarah, because the playful swipes and pounces that were harmless when Nala weighed 5 kilograms became potentially dangerous as she approached 30 and then 40 kilograms. David McCona had warned Sarah that the visits would eventually need to be modified as Nala matured into full size and strength, and that even the most well-intentioned young lion could cause serious injury through play behaviors that involved claws and teeth that were designed for bringing down large prey animals. But during those 10 months when Nala was still technically a cub despite her increasing size, the relationship felt uncomplicated and pure in ways that Sarah cherished as perhaps the most meaningful connection she had formed with any being, human or animal, in her entire life. But life had intervened as it always does, and Sarah's responsibilities as a ranger had increased with a promotion that brought more administrative duties and less field time, and the 3 times per week visits had gradually become weekly, then monthly, then occasional, until they stopped entirely by 2009, when the demands of her career and the simple fact that Nala was growing into a healthy adult lioness who no longer needed human attention for survival had made the visits feel less essential. Sarah's last visit to see Nala had been in December 2009, 6 years before the accident that would destroy Sarah's career and identity and body, and she had felt guilty about the declining frequency of visits but had rationalized that Nala was thriving and that the lioness had probably forgotten about their early bond in the way that animals naturally moved on from temporary care relationships once they reached independence. The accident had happened on a Thursday evening in March 2015, almost exactly 10 years after Sarah had found Nala dying in that rocky depression, though Sarah wouldn't consciously make that connection until much later when she was reviewing the timeline during one of the therapy sessions that weren't helping her deal with the trauma and loss. Sarah had been driving home after a long day coordinating anti-poaching patrols when a truck ran a red light at an intersection on the outskirts of Nelspruit, and the driver was later found to have a blood alcohol level 3 times the legal limit, though that knowledge did nothing to undo the damage his vehicle had done when it struck Sarah's truck at 80 kilometers per hour and sent it spinning across the intersection before slamming into a concrete barrier. Sarah remembered the impact and the sound of metal crushing and glass shattering, and she remembered a moment of weightlessness during the spin before the second impact with the barrier, but she had no memory of the immediate aftermath because the trauma had caused unconsciousness that lasted until she woke in the hospital emergency room surrounded by doctors and nurses who were working to stabilize her condition and assess the extent of her injuries. The seconds before impact had unfolded with the strange time dilation that people often reported experiencing during traumatic events, where everything seemed to slow down and became hyper-aware even as the conscious mind struggled to process what was happening. Sarah had been stopped at the red light listening to radio chatter from other ranger units still conducting patrols in the park, and she had been planning her evening routine in the automatic way that people did when driving familiar routes toward home. The light had changed to green, and Sarah had begun to accelerate through the intersection without the slightest awareness that death was hurtling toward her from the cross street at speeds that made collision inevitable regardless of what evasive actions she might have taken if she had noticed the threat in time to react. The truck that hit her was a large commercial vehicle, significantly heavier than Sarah's standard Ranger truck, and the driver had not even attempted to brake when he ran the red light because his alcohol-impaired brain had either failed to register the signal or had lost the executive function necessary to translate perception into action. Witnesses who later testified at the criminal trial against the drunk driver reported that they had screamed or honked their horns trying to warn Sarah about the oncoming collision, but the truck's speed and the geometry of the intersection meant that warning came too late to be useful. The impact struck the driver's side of Sarah's truck at a near-perfect 90-degree angle, transferring enormous kinetic energy directly into the passenger compartment where Sarah sat unaware until the final instant before metal met metal. The sound of the collision was described by witnesses as deafening, a sheer cascade of tearing metal and exploding glass that created noise levels loud enough to trigger car alarms in vehicles parked 100 meters away. Sarah's truck was lifted off its wheels by the force of the impact and sent spinning across the intersection, rotating nearly 360 degrees before the momentum carried it toward the concrete traffic barrier that lined the edge of the intersection. The second impact when Sarah's truck struck the barrier was less violent than the initial collision but more catastrophic in its consequences because the deceleration forces compressed the passenger compartment in ways that caused the kind of spinal trauma that destroyed neural pathways and ended Sarah's life as a ranger even as it left her biologically alive. Sarah's memory of regaining consciousness in the emergency room came in fragments that never assembled into a coherent narrative, suggesting that her level of awareness had fluctuated between conscious and unconscious states as medical personnel worked to stabilize her vital signs and prevent shock from causing organ failure. She remembered faces hovering above her, masked and focused and communicating in the efficient shorthand that emergency medical professionals used when time mattered more than courtesy. She remembered pain, though oddly not in her back or legs where the actual injury existed but in her left arm, which had apparently struck something during the collision and sustained fractures that were minor compared to the spinal damage but that her brain chose to prioritize in terms of conscious perception. She remembered asking about her truck and being confused by the question because vehicles shouldn't matter when injuries needed treatment, though later she understood that her brain had been trying to orient itself by focusing on concrete details rather than processing the implications of paralysis that she didn't yet understand she had sustained. The thoracic vertebra T12 had suffered a complete fracture that severed the spinal cord, creating paralysis from the waist down that the neurosurgeon explained would be permanent because spinal cord tissue does not regenerate and the damage was too extensive for surgical repair to restore any function below the injury site. The neurosurgeon who delivered this diagnosis was Dr. Michelle Katza, a specialist with 2 decades of experience treating spinal trauma, and she had seen enough patients struggle with denial and false hope to know that clarity and directness were more compassionate than gentle evasions that delayed acceptance of unchangeable reality. She told Sarah plainly that she would never walk again, that sensation and voluntary movement below the T12 injury site were permanently lost, and that the focus now needed to be on preventing secondary complications and learning to function as a wheelchair user rather than hoping for miraculous recoveries that did not occur in cases with complete cord transection. Sarah's initial response to this diagnosis was not the emotional breakdown that popular media might have predicted but rather a kind of numb dissociation where she heard the words and understood their literal meaning but could not connect that meaning to herself or her future in any concrete way. The person Dr. Katza was describing sounded like someone else, some other Sarah Mitchell who would have to use a wheelchair and learn to manage basic life activities through adaptive equipment and accept fundamental limitations on the life she could live. The ranger Sarah Mitchell, who had spent 15 years protecting wildlife through physical capability and field expertise, couldn't be the same person as wheelchair Sarah Mitchell, and so in those first hours and days after diagnosis, Sarah's mind simply refused to integrate these incompatible identities into a single coherent sense of self. The 6 months following the accident had been a descent into darkness that Sarah experienced as a kind of slow drowning where each day took her deeper into depression and hopelessness despite the well-meaning efforts of physical therapists and occupational therapists and psychologists who tried to help her adjust to her new reality and find meaning in a life that looked nothing like what she had planned or wanted. Sarah's identity had been fundamentally tied to her physical capabilities and to her role as a ranger protecting wildlife through active field work that required mobility and strength. And losing those capabilities felt like losing herself in ways that made her question why she should continue living when the person she had been was effectively dead even though her body still functioned in its diminished capacity. The suicidal ideation had started around month 3 when the initial hope that maybe the doctors were wrong about the permanence of the paralysis had faded in the face of unchanged sensation and function below the injury site. And Sarah had found herself researching methods and planning scenarios in ways that terrified the rational part of her brain that still wanted to live but that felt inevitable to the depressed part that saw no path forward worth taking. She hadn't told her physical therapist Jenny about these thoughts because she knew that disclosure would lead to psychiatric intervention and possibly hospitalization, and she maintained enough executive function to present a facade of coping and acceptance during her therapy sessions while privately spiraling deeper into despair. David McCona's phone call had come on a Tuesday afternoon in September 2015, 6 months post-accident, and Sarah almost didn't answer because she had been isolating from friends and colleagues and ignoring most communications from the outside world. But something made her pick up, maybe just the automatic habit of answering phones, or maybe some unconscious part of her brain recognizing that she needed intervention from somewhere even if her conscious mind had given up hope. David had been brief and direct in his proposal. "Sarah, I know you're going through hell. I heard about the accident and I'm so sorry. I want to invite you to come visit Nala. I think it might help. I think she might remember you." Sarah's first response had been to decline because the thought of Nala seeing her like this, broken and useless in a wheelchair, felt unbearable in ways she couldn't fully articulate. But David had been persistent without being pushy, and he had said something that penetrated Sarah's defenses. "She's not doing great, Sarah. She's healthy physically, but something's off emotionally. The keepers think she's depressed. Maybe you could help each other." That manipulation through shared suffering had worked where direct appeals to Sarah's own well-being had failed, and she had agreed to the visit scheduled for the following Sunday morning when the sanctuary would be closed to general visitors and they could arrange private access to Nala without crowds or distractions. Sarah had spent the intervening days oscillating between hope and dread, wanting desperately to believe that Nala would remember her but simultaneously protecting herself from disappointment by rehearsing all the rational reasons why a lion wouldn't maintain memories of a human across 10 years of separation. And now here she was watching Nala press her head against the glass barrier opposite Sarah's face, and the evidence was undeniable that something profound was being remembered and recognized despite the decade and the wheelchair and all the ways Sarah had changed. The first visit lasted 2 hours, far longer than David had initially planned to allow, but the interaction between Sarah and Nala was so remarkable that he kept extending the time because what he was witnessing needed to be observed and documented and understood as fully as possible. Nala remained at the glass barrier for the entire duration, occasionally shifting position but never moving away from Sarah, and she continued making those rumbling greeting vocalizations at intervals that seemed to correspond to moments when Sarah spoke or moved in ways that triggered additional memories or associations. At one point Sarah asked if she could speak to Nala more directly, and when David confirmed that lions couldn't understand words but responded to tone and familiar voice patterns, Sarah began talking to Nala about the rescue 10 years earlier, describing in detail how she had found her and driven for 3 hours and refused to let her die, and whether through memory or simple response to Sarah's emotional tone, Nala's behavior suggested engagement and recognition throughout this monologue. When the visit ended and keepers came to return Nala to her regular enclosure, the lioness showed clear reluctance to leave, looking back repeatedly at Sarah as she was guided away and making sounds that David interpreted as protest or distress at the separation. Sarah was emotionally exhausted from the intensity of the experience, and she cried openly during the drive home in ways she hadn't allowed herself to cry since the accident because this had given her something she didn't know she needed. Proof that who she had been still mattered, that the good she had done in saving Nala's life had not been erased by the accident, that she was still remembered and valued by at least one being in the world even if that being was a lion rather than a human. David called Sarah the next day with a proposal that violated normal sanctuary protocols but that he felt was justified by the extraordinary circumstances and the potential therapeutic benefits for both Sarah and Nala. Would Sarah be willing to commit to regular visits on a schedule that Nala could potentially learn and anticipate? Because the keepers had noticed that Nala's behavior after Sarah's visit had been notably more positive and engaged than her typical demeanor over recent months. Sarah had intended to say she could manage weekly visits because even that would require significant effort given her mobility limitations and the hour-long drive to the sanctuary, but what came out of her mouth was, "Can I come every day?" followed immediately by embarrassment at the neediness and impossibility of such a request. David's response surprised her. "Let's start with 3 times per week and see how it goes for both of you. Monday, Wednesday, Friday. 9 a.m. We'll make arrangements." Sarah had hung up the phone and cried again, but this time from relief and gratitude rather than grief, because for the first time since the accident she had something to look forward to, some structure and purpose beyond the endless cycle of therapy appointments and doctor visits that weren't helping her find reasons to continue living. The Monday, Wednesday, Friday schedule began the following week, and within 2 weeks Sarah had negotiated with David to increase to 5 days per week, and by the end of the first month she was coming every single day including weekends because the visits had become the only part of her life that felt meaningful and the only time she experienced something like joy or connection or hope. The daily visits established a ritual that both Sarah and Nala came to depend on in ways that became increasingly obvious to sanctuary staff who observed the pattern developing. Sarah would arrive each morning at exactly 9 o'clock, wheel herself to the special viewing area that David had designated for her visits, and wait while keepers brought Nala from her enclosure. The lioness quickly learned the schedule and would position herself near the transfer area at approximately 8:45 each morning, clearly anticipating Sarah's arrival in ways that demonstrated both memory and time sense that exceeded what many people assumed lions possessed. When Nala entered the viewing area and saw Sarah, she would immediately make those rumbling greeting vocalizations and move to the glass barrier to press her head against the surface opposite Sarah's position, and they would remain in that configuration for anywhere from 30 minutes to 3 hours depending on Sarah's energy level and schedule constraints. The sanctuary staff began documenting this daily pattern with notes and occasional photographs because they recognized that what they were observing represented something unusual and potentially significant for understanding lion cognition and memory. The head keeper, a man named Peter Kumalo who had worked with lions for 30 years, reported to David that Nala's behavior around Sarah was unlike anything he had seen in 3 decades of observing captive lion interactions with humans. Peter noted that Nala showed none of the typical dominance or territorial behaviors that adult lionesses usually displayed toward unfamiliar visitors, and instead showed the kind of recognition and positive engagement that family dogs might show toward beloved owners after brief separations. More remarkably, Nala seemed to understand that Sarah was different from other visitors in ways that went beyond simple recognition, because the lioness adjusted her behavior to accommodate Sarah's wheelchair in ways that suggested awareness of Sarah's mobility limitations. When healthy visitors stood at the glass barrier, Nala would typically stand as well or pace back and forth along the barrier, creating dynamic interaction. But with Sarah, Nala consistently sat or lay down near the glass, positioning herself at Sarah's eye level and remaining relatively still in ways that facilitated the kind of calm, sustained interaction that Sarah seemed to need. Several staff members commented that it appeared as if Nala understood that Sarah was injured or compromised in some way and was adapting her behavior to meet Sarah where she was rather than expecting Sarah to accommodate Nala's typical activity level. The content of Sarah's monologues during these daily visits evolved over the months from primarily expressions of grief and anger about the accident to more forward-looking discussions of goals and possibilities and incremental improvements in her condition. She told Nala about physical therapy sessions and the small victories of being able to sit up independently or transfer from bed to wheelchair without assistance, and she described the frustrations of dealing with phantom pain sensations in legs that she couldn't feel or move. She talked about her fears for the future and her struggle to imagine a life that felt worth living when all her identity and purpose had been tied to physical capabilities that no longer existed. And gradually, as the months accumulated and the daily routine with Nala became the anchor around which her life reorganized itself, Sarah began talking about hope and possibility and the maybe someday idea that she might walk again even though medical professionals kept telling her such recovery was impossible. Nala's responses to these changing emotional tones were subtle but observable to people who watched the interactions regularly. When Sarah was crying or expressing particular distress, Nala would press more firmly against the glass barrier and increase her vocalizations in ways that seemed like attempts at comfort or reassurance. When Sarah was calmer or even occasionally laughing at something funny that had happened during therapy, Nala's body language relaxed and she might even engage in play behaviors like swatting at insects or batting at enrichment items while maintaining awareness of Sarah's presence. The correlation between Sarah's emotional state and Nala's behavioral responses suggested that the lioness was tracking and responding to human emotional cues in ways that went beyond simple conditioning or learned behaviors. Sarah talked to Nala during these visits, processing her grief and anger and fear in ways she couldn't do with human therapists or friends because Nala's acceptance felt absolute and unjudging in ways that human sympathy never achieved. She told Nala about her frustrations with physical therapy and her rage at the drunk driver who had destroyed her life and her terror that she would never matter to anyone again. And whether or not Nala understood the content of these confessions didn't matter because the lioness's consistent presence and attention provided the validation and witness that Sarah needed to begin processing trauma that had been stuck in her body and mind since the accident. Sometimes Sarah would cry during these visits, tears flowing freely in ways she controlled everywhere else, and Nala would respond by pressing more firmly against the glass or making soft sounds that felt like comfort even though Sarah knew intellectually that lions probably weren't capable of empathy in human terms. The transformation that occurred in Sarah over those 6 months of daily visits was dramatic enough that every person in her life noticed changes even if they couldn't understand or approve of the source. Her physical therapist, Jenny, began incorporating Sarah's visits to Nala into the treatment planning, scheduled therapy sessions for afternoons so that Sarah could prioritize her morning sanctuary visits without feeling conflicted about missing appointments. Jenny noted in her clinical records that Sarah's motivation and effort during therapy had improved substantially since beginning the daily lion visits, and that Sarah was setting incremental goals and working toward them with persistence that had been absent during the first months after injury. The correlation was clear even if the mechanism remained mysterious. Whatever was happening between Sarah and Nala at the sanctuary was creating psychological benefits that translated into improved physical rehabilitation outcomes. Sarah's depression screening scores measured during routine medical follow-ups showed steady improvement over the 6-month period, moving from the severe range that had triggered recommendations for psychiatric medication to moderate and eventually mild levels that suggested improving mood and decreasing suicidal ideation. When doctors asked what had changed to account for this improvement, Sarah's answer was always the same. She was visiting Nala daily, and that relationship was giving her reasons to keep living and working toward recovery. The doctors didn't know quite what to do with this information because lion visits weren't part of any standard treatment protocol for spinal injury or depression, but they couldn't argue with results that showed measurable improvement in both psychological and physical functioning. The therapeutic benefits of the visits became apparent to everyone in Sarah's life, even though Sarah herself was the last to recognize the changes occurring. Jenny, her physical therapist, noted that Sarah's engagement with therapy exercises had improved dramatically and that she was setting goals and working toward them in ways she hadn't demonstrated during the first 6 months post-accident. Sarah's doctor observed that her depression screening scores were improving and that she had stopped making concerning statements about wanting to die or feeling that life wasn't worth living. The few friends who still maintained contact commented that Sarah seemed more present during conversations and less trapped in the past grieving who she used to be. But when they asked what had changed, Sarah's answer was always the same: "I've been visiting Nala, the lion I rescued 10 years ago. She remembers me." The skepticism Sarah encountered when she tried to explain the importance of these visits to people who hadn't witnessed the interaction between her and Nala was frustrating and isolating because reducing their relationship to visits with an animal missed the entire point of what was happening. People would say things like, "That's nice that you have a hobby," or "Animals can be very therapeutic," in tones that suggested they were humoring her rather than understanding that this was not about pet therapy or recreational animal watching, but about being remembered and valued by a being whose memory mattered precisely because it was uncomplicated by human social obligations or pity or the kind of false encouragement that well-meaning people offered to make themselves feel better about her condition. Nala didn't remember Sarah because she felt obligated to or because she pitted Sarah's disability, but because their connection 10 years earlier had mattered enough to leave permanent traces in neural pathways that survived a decade of separation. The breakthrough came approximately 6 months into the daily visits when Sarah's physical therapist, Jenny, conducted a routine assessment and discovered something that contradicted every neurological prediction about Sarah's injury. There was sensation returning to Sarah's lower legs. Not full feeling but definite responses to pressure and temperature that should not have been possible given the complete spinal cord severance that had been documented in her initial imaging. Jenny ordered new MRI scans and consulted with the neurosurgeon who had performed Sarah's initial emergency surgery, and the images revealed something unexpected. While the original spinal cord damage was indeed severe and permanent, there had been enough tissue bridge remaining across the injury site to allow some degree of nerve regeneration over time. Something that occurred in perhaps 5% of cases that were initially diagnosed as complete cord transections. The neurosurgeon was cautious about raising hopes because even with this unexpected regeneration, the likelihood of regaining functional mobility was still extremely low, and the sensation Sarah was experiencing might represent the maximum recovery possible rather than an early stage of progressive improvement. But the possibility of any improvement at all was enough to ignite something in Sarah that had been dormant since the accident. Determination and fighting spirit and the belief that maybe, just maybe, she could reclaim some of what had been taken from her. She threw herself into physical therapy with intensity that worried Jenny because the risk of injury from overexertion was real, but Sarah couldn't be persuaded to moderate her efforts because she had a goal now that mattered more than safety. She wanted to walk again, and she wanted her first steps to be in front of Nala. The progression from sensation to movement took another 3 months of grueling daily therapy that left Sarah exhausted and sore in ways that felt almost good because pain meant her body was working and responding and changing. First came the ability to flex her toes voluntarily, tiny movements that most people took for granted but that represented miracles to Sarah because they demonstrated that signals from her brain could reach her feet despite the damaged cord. Then came ankle movements, then knee flexion. Each small advancement celebrated and built upon through exercises that gradually strengthened muscles that had atrophied during 6 months of disuse. The progress was non-linear and frustrating with setbacks and plateaus that tested Sarah's determination, but she persisted because every morning when she visited Nala she would talk about her goals and progress. and Nala's steady presence felt like accountability and encouragement rolled into a package that didn't require Sarah to perform optimism or hide frustration. By month 9 post-accident, Sarah could stand with assistance from parallel bars in the physical therapy gym, bearing weight on legs that trembled and threatened to collapse but that held long enough for Jenny to document the achievement and for Sarah to feel genuine hope that walking might be possible rather than just a fantasy she used to motivate herself through painful exercises. The goal became concrete and specific. Sarah wanted to take steps independently without parallel bars or walkers, and she wanted to do it in front of Nala at the sanctuary during one of their daily visits. David agreed to facilitate this attempt with appropriate safety measures including crash mats and multiple people positioned to catch Sarah if she fell, and they scheduled the walking attempt for a Sunday morning when the sanctuary was closed and there would be privacy for what might be a triumph or might be a devastating failure. The morning of the walking attempt, Sarah woke with a mixture of terror and excitement that made her nauseous and unable to eat breakfast, and she arrived at the sanctuary at 8 a.m. instead of her usual 9 o'clock because nervous energy made sitting still impossible. Jenny had come with her to provide physical support and coaching, and David had arranged for the viewing area to be equipped with the same kind of parallel bars that Sarah trained with in the physical therapy gym so that she could use them for initial standing before attempting independent steps. Nala was brought to the viewing area early and clearly sensed that something unusual was happening based on the changed routine and the extra people present, and she paced along the glass barrier in ways that communicated alertness and mild agitation. Sarah transferred from her wheelchair to the parallel bars with Jenny's assistance, and the familiar burn of muscle strain shot through her legs as she bore weight that her body still wasn't accustomed to supporting for extended periods. She stood for 30 seconds catching her breath and letting her legs adjust to the load, and she looked at Nala through the glass barrier and said, "Watch me. Please watch me. I'm going to walk for you." Nala stopped pacing and sat down facing Sarah in the same position she always took during their visits. And whether the lioness understood what was about to happen or simply responded to Sarah's tone, her focused attention felt like exactly the witness Sarah needed for this moment. Sarah released her grip on the parallel bars and stood without support for the first time in 9 months, and her legs shook violently with the effort of maintaining balance, but they held, and she took her first independent step forward with her right foot, then brought her left foot forward to meet it. 2 steps. She had taken 2 steps without assistance or support equipment, and the euphoria of that achievement made her want to laugh and cry simultaneously. She took a 3rd step, then a 4th, her arms spread slightly for balance and her entire focus narrowed to the simple mechanics of shifting weight and moving feet forward without falling. 5 steps. 6. She had walked 6 steps before her legs began to buckle, and Jenny moved in quickly to catch her and guide her back to the wheelchair, but those 6 steps represented a victory that mattered more than any physical achievement Sarah had accomplished in her entire previous life. "Nala, did you see?" Sarah was laughing and crying as Jenny helped her sit, her legs trembling with exhaustion but her heart soaring with accomplishment and gratitude and the overwhelming sense that this had been possible because of Nala's daily presence and the motivation that their relationship had provided. I actually walked, for you. Because of you." Nala vocalized in response to Sarah's emotional display, making the rumbling greeting sound that Sarah had come to recognize as the lioness's way of expressing positive engagement, and she pressed her massive head against the glass barrier directly opposite where Sarah sat in her wheelchair, creating that familiar moment of connection that had defined their relationship since that first reunion visit 6 months earlier. David had recorded the entire walking attempt on video, and he shared it with Sarah's medical team who reviewed the footage with amazement because the neurological recovery Sarah had achieved was extraordinary given her initial diagnosis and prognosis. The case became a subject of interest for researchers studying spinal cord injury recovery, and several academic papers were eventually published examining the combination of factors that might have contributed to Sarah's unexpected improvement. The partial tissue bridge that had allowed nerve regeneration, the intensive physical therapy that Sarah had maintained with unusual dedication, and intriguingly, the psychological factors including motivation and emotional support that Sarah credited to her daily visits with Nala and that might have influenced her neurological healing through mechanisms that medical science was only beginning to understand regarding the connections between mental state and physical recovery. If this story moved you, if it challenged your assumptions about how long animals can remember humans who mattered to them and made you consider the possibility that healing comes from unexpected sources when we're open to receiving it, we would be honored if you would share your thoughts and reactions in the comments below. Have you ever been remembered by an animal after years of separation in ways that proved the relationship had mattered as deeply to them as it did to you? Have you experienced healing or recovery that came from sources your doctors never prescribed and that conventional medicine couldn't explain? Your stories and reflections matter because they contribute to understanding about the power of connection and memory across species boundaries, and they remind us that the good we do in the world leaves traces that persist even when we can't see them, and that sometimes being remembered is the most powerful medicine available for healing wounds that go deeper than flesh and bone. Please subscribe to Lion King Stories for more incredible true tales that prove love and memory transcend the limitations we assume define animal consciousness, that the bonds we form with other beings can become lifelines when we need them most, and that sometimes salvation comes not from human intervention but from being witnessed and remembered by a lion who refuses to forget who saved her life 10 years ago, when refusing to forget means everything to both of them. Thank you for being part of our pride and for opening your heart to stories that challenge our assumptions and expand our understanding of what animals remember and how deeply relationships with humans can matter to them across years and circumstances that should erase all traces but somehow don't.